Okay, everybody got quiet, so I guess it's time to start. We're going to take a little bit of a departure from what we've been doing the last several Sunday nights, and for the next quarter, we're going to be doing a class called Family Matters. I've taught this class in the high school last quarter, and when they asked me to teach it in the auditorium class, I realized I was going to have to refine it significantly to do it in this class. I will tell you that if you have a high school student in one of our high school classes, you ought to be very proud. We have a great group of kids in our high school class, and they are very astute. They came up with a number of questions that, quite frankly, I knew they were going to come up with, and I was going to have trouble answering. And we're going to have the same thing in here, I'm sure. This is going to be a little bit different class, perhaps, than what you're used to. I am not going to stand up here and tell you how to raise your children. Or if you've already raised your children, I'm not going to tell you what you should have done differently. We are going to take families throughout the Old Testament predominantly, and we're going to break them down. And we're going to look at a number of different things. We're going to look at the structure. We're going to look at some of the issues that they ran into. And we're going to look at maybe some unique circumstances that they would be dealing with that we might not have to deal with today, or perhaps circumstances that we would in fact be dealing with today. And we will look at those individually. We will deal with things like polygamy. That's going to be an interesting discussion. I don't know about you guys, but I had always wondered, all my life I have wondered why God allowed polygamy in the Old Testament with men who were supposedly men of God, and yet they had multiple wives. I couldn't reconcile that. Still can't reconcile that. Maybe you can help me with that. But we're going to talk about it. Tonight's by way of introduction. We're going to use, quite frankly, my family. Not my immediate family. My wife just nearly fainted. Not my immediate family. I have had to, over the course of the last 3 months, had to deal with the death of my father. 5 years ago, the death of my mother, and earlier last year, the death of my little brother. But I can deal with, and in doing that, I have come across things that my parents had set aside that were quite interesting. My parents had the foresight to talk to my grandparents before they passed and get some history about what their history was, how they grew up, what were the circumstances around how they grew up. And it's quite eye-opening when you understand the background of what people deal with as they impart that to their families and the things that they have to deal with, the circumstances that are involved, and the hardships that they have to go through. And we all have to deal with those things. We all have those hardships. We all have those trials. And some of that determines and always impacts our family. We're going to start with a pop quiz. You ready? I know this is the first night. We're going to have a pop quiz, 2 questions. How many of you have been or are part of a family? That's an easy one, right? All right, next question. Get ready. This is tougher. How many of you are or have been part of a perfect family? Good answer. And I think what we're going to find as we get into a study of the Old Testament families, that they are the same way. Great heroes of faith, people that show up in Hebrews 11, and yet their families are a mess. We're going to deal with family structure, and it was surprising to me as I went into various Old Testament families. This family structure is not, we've got a standard that we think, in fact, you're going to see my standard here shortly. standard of what we think is a good family structure. Husband, wife, 3 kids. That's it, right? Some of you, and I don't know that you're mixture, but in my case, it was 2 boys and a girl. My parents, I followed their example, 2 boys and a girl. So that was our example. That's the perfect family, right? Perfect nuclear family, husband, wife, 3 kids. Very seldom do your Old Testament families follow that model. In fact, it may be husband, wife, wife, or husband, wife, 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 kids, 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 wife, no kids. It might be husband, wife, husband later on. In fact, in a couple of situations, you've got adoptions. Husband, wife, children, adopted child. The family is diverse. It's diverse in the Old Testament. God put a prescription out there for family, and he said, this is it, but it looks so much different. Whenever man gets involved, there is no perfection. And therefore, God put a perfect model out there for the family, and I don't mean that to mean 3 kids, but he put a perfect model out there for the family, and then man started adding his things to it. So we'll look at structure. We'll look at the various roles within this structure from a biblical standpoint, and we'll look at, as we look at individual families, we'll begin to look at the individual roles within those families. So it may be that in some situations in these families, they have messed up the roles. And we'll deal with that as we go through these individual families. Oh, I did want to tell you, if you're going to be in this class, there will be homework. By the way, I gave the high school kids homework. It will be different. So the high school kids homework I gave them was, every week, we started it easy. We said, do a random act of kindness for someone in your family. And the next week it was, do 2 random acts of kindness. And the next week it was, do a random act of kindness for an acquaintance. Anyway, you get the idea. It got up to where it was random act of kindness for perfect strangers. We're not going to do that. Yours is easy. You just have to read. Because in the high school class, we could read whole chapters and then discuss. I don't know that we could read through 2 and 3 chapters at a time for various families and then have any time left over for discussion, so we're not going to do that. You'll have to read that in advance, and then we'll discuss when you come back. We will look at relationship dynamics within that structure. Once you've built a structure, how does the husband and wife relate? And in Scripture, you can tell that information. In most cases, you can glean that information. How do husband and wife relate? How do husband and child relate? How do wife and child relate? In some cases, it's how do wife and wife relate? Or how do child from one mother relate to child from another mother? And so you've got relationships within that family, and we'll look at those dynamics and what they do as far as how the family is built and the success of that family. What are the advantages to this structure? There are Old Testament families that are structured certain ways because it creates advantages. And we'll look at those. What are the advantages for those structures? And then, more often than not, what are the challenges and problems caused by that structure? We talked about I don't want to give you too much information, but we talked about the polygamy. In some cases, polygamy in and of itself was something of a punishment. If you look at the dynamics between wife and wife. So if you wanted to go down that road, The other thing, and you already know this, is if you've been a part of a family, and I've had the pleasure of being a part of two families, the one I grew up in and the one I created myself, families are unique. My own family is different from the family I grew up in. PJ brings to our relationship a whole host of things that she grew up in. And so we get to kind of mix and match all of those different experiences and cultures from where we grew up and the people that we knew and the interactions that we had. Her parents were significantly different from my parents. Thankfully, both sets of parents loved the Lord, and that made it much easier. Families are unique. How does this impact the family structure? Well, if there's a different set of beliefs, there's going to be impact to the family structure. And as we go through these Old Testament families, we will see that. Impact individual family members. You know, if my wife thinks one thing and I think another thing, our kids are somewhat caught in the middle. We never had a big issue with getting on the same page. But it can impact, and you'll see this, again, as we go into Old Testament families, you will see where the wife is saying one thing and the husband is saying another thing, and the kids are caught in the middle. And it creates challenges. And then finally, as we look to explore Old Testament families, and you all know this, families are messy. Families are messy. Again, there is not a perfect family. You have not been a part of a perfect family. But what we'll find is, as we go through the different Old Testament families, there are failures of individual roles. Either the father did not fulfill their role that they were supposed to fulfill, the mother did not fulfill a role that they were supposed to fulfill, or in some way the children did not fulfill their role. And those things carry over to today. If the father does not fulfill their role as outlined by God, there are problems. If the mother does not fulfill their role as outlined by God, there are problems. And children are always problems. No. There may be impacts of unique situations. Each of the families we will deal with will have some kind of unique situation. There will be situations that they will have that none of us will ever have or ever see or ever experience. But by the same token, there will be situations that we will have that they would not have been aware of or been able to experience. That's just the way it is. Each of us as a member of a family or each of our families will deal with very unique situations. Matters of environment, matters of finance, matters of peer pressure. All of those things come together to build or to attempt to destroy a family. And all of them will impact our families. Thoughts that you have? Yes, sir. Wait a minute, now you can't go ahead. You take all the discussion away from Noah, and then we'll just have a big quiet auditorium when we do Noah. Okay, all right. Hold that thought, write it down. All right.
I'm always impressed with Noah because the whole world, every thought of man was evil all the time. And he withstood that, and his family was all saved.
Exactly. And see, that's a whole bullet point around Noah that I was going to talk about regarding peer pressure. I mean, think about it. Who else in the world, what other family dealt with the peer pressure that Noah's family dealt with? Everybody in the world is evil except Noah and his family. to your point. Now, y'all just kind of forget all that until we deal with it when we talk about Noah. Other thoughts that you have? Keaton?
You know, I think one of the reasons God places such an emphasis on this, and we see it all throughout scriptural history, is the family will dictate so much of the future, good and bad. And you see families that align with God's values and principles, and their family change things for the good. And you see that family structure break down, and almost every time things got worse. And you know, you look at, well, why does it matter about family? Because, you know, even considering past, you know, all of us have stuff going on. The right family comes along, and you talk about the family you built versus the family you were handed. You build the right family, and it can change the trajectory of everything from that moment in history on. And, you know, everybody has that opportunity, and we see people in the Bible did something similar. Even though they were handed a bad hand, so to speak, they decided, I'm going to follow God's structure, and, you know, good things happen from it. So, you know, there's so much potential based on the way the family's designed.
And you know, especially, that's very important, especially in this day and age. As we've talked about repeatedly, there is an attack on the family structure, the basic building block of society. And if we can tear that down, everything else follows. You know, we will run into situations as we study the Old Testament where it makes absolutely no sense. You'll have one child who was off the charts good and another child who is completely opposite. And both raised the same way by all indication. Did you?
We were not blessed with children. And don't try to give me your children.
You're still a family, though.
Really?
Yes. Yes. I don't think that it has to be defined as having children. But you were a part of a family that did have children, or you wouldn't be here, obviously. Yes, ma'am.
What Keaton was saying, I think, you know, in foster care, you see a lot of the generational habits continued with the children that were with the parents if you don't see someone come in and break that cycle.
That's exactly right.
And so it follows them unless you do have someone come in and you tell them about God and you break that cycle.
And what we will be looking at is even, again, what we would consider great families and great men throughout the Bible, they had their problems. Yes, sir, Rocky?
You made the point, and I assume sometime later you'll talk about it, but, yeah, why is that? I think you have to boil it down to people have free will, and we have to be careful when we look at the examples in the Old Testament, because we're not given all the details.
Sure.
And when we are told about the descendants of different families being evil, they had already reached the cul-de-sac, so they were already responsible for their own actions. So we're not always given enough details to infer that, well, this kid became evil because his parents didn't raise him upright, or his parents raised him upright, and everybody is different, and he just gave in to the temptations that maybe some of the other children did. And that's the dilemma there.
I absolutely agree with you. I think sometimes we assign a cause and effect to how a child turns out. That may not always be the case. To your point, each of our children have free will. We have all had free will. You may have had siblings, they all had free will. And although you were raised in the same household, you may have gone in completely different directions. We don't know why. I'm not even going to stand up here and try to. All we can do is study the examples that we have and try to make some inferences from those examples.
I mean, think about the implications of that. If that wasn't true, that means that when did children ever start sinning? Because if they were raised right in the beginning, they would never sin.
That's right.
At the very beginning, we had Adam and Eve, and we had Cain killing Abel.
Now wait a minute. See,
Nobody ever killed.
You're getting off on next week's lesson. Now stop that.
Because nobody had ever murdered before.
That's right.
Where did he pick that up at?
See, now Rocky's,
He didn't learn it from his mom and dad.
because it's never been done before.
Mom and dad didn't teach him that.
That's right. So Rocky's already gotten into next week's lesson. We're going to talk about Adam and Eve. So, but that's the point. That's what I'm trying to make. There are so many different causes and effects that in some cases we don't understand. And as we get into this class, we will break down the different family structures and the different family dynamics and the different roles associated with this. And you know what? We may not figure out what went wrong. We'll just know that something went wrong somewhere along the line. Or maybe something went right. It's not always about going wrong. Barry?
Sometimes God uses people as tools, as in like Pharaoh, to show his power and stuff. And so sometimes that could be the case of why the child went bad, according to.
Yeah, so Barry didn't name the actual lesson, but later on we will get into the prophet Hosea. You want to find out about a dysfunctional family, go read Hosea. But it's dictated by God. We talked a little bit about this. Somebody turn over to 1 Timothy 3, 2 and 12. I'm going to go ahead and read Ephesians 5, starting in 23 or 22. So whoever's going to get 1 Timothy, get that. And then somebody get 1 Timothy 3:11, Proverbs 12:4. We'll not do the 10 through 31. Get those while I'm getting Ephesians. Ephesians 5, starting in verse 22. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. So there's the first piece of structure. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, wives. For the husband is the head of the wife, as also Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. I do want to point out here, for the husband is the head of the wife. Singular. One. And how many churches do we have? One. So there's a correlation there, right? One head, one church, one husband, one wife. Again, we'll talk about that later on. One covenant. Well, we could get off into a bunch of ones, but therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. See how he's defining the dynamic between the husband and the wife, between the two roles there? I preach a wedding ceremony, and when I do that, there's a thing in there that when God took the rib, he took a rib from Adam. He didn't take a bone from Adam's foot that the wife would be subservient to him and be under his feet. He didn't take a bone from Adam's head that the wife would be over him. He took a rib from Adam's side that the wife would be a partner, that the wife would serve as a helpmeet as originally designed, that they would share in the responsibilities. Don't get me wrong, the ultimate response, sometimes we look at subjective, as the wife being in subjection as The wife has to do everything I say. For those of you who have been married very long, you know that doesn't work well. But it's a helper. And it doesn't say, husbands, you're the boss and you lord it over them. It says, husbands, you love your wives like you love yourself. And I think we miss that part sometimes. And it becomes, we start talking about subjection and it becomes, you listen to me. Husbands, love your wives as you love yourselves. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this reason, and he's quoting from Genesis here, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. God laid out the model. That's the model. There's an interaction there between man and wife. And again, we as humans are very imperfect in how we adopt that model many times. And it's not a failure of God's model, it's a failure of what we've done to it. Who has 1 Timothy 3, 2 and 12? This, by the way, this is the exhortation from Paul to Timothy regarding the qualifications of elders and deacons.
Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife. And then in verse 12 it says, let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children in their own households well.
All right? So I know that that's an exhortation regarding deacons and elders, but is there some reason that that doesn't apply? I mean, does everybody else get their own, they do whatever? Is there a reason that God said, well, we're only going to make the elders and deacons be the husband of one wife. Everybody else can do what they want. You think he sets one standard for elders and deacons and a different standard for everybody else as far as marriage is concerned? Yes, sir.
Malachi chapter 2, verse 15, it just kind of expands on what you read in Ephesians and you talked about in Genesis, but it says, did he not make them one with a portion of the Spirit in their union? And this is all in the context of don't cheat on your wife, don't divorce her. But it's the singularity of one. He even later calls it a covenant. Mm-hmm. And so it's very important. And it's even sealed with the Spirit.
And that's 400 years, Malachi's 400 years before Christ. So even though early, as we talk about a number of the Old Testament families and you start to deal with things like polygamy and intermarriage and things along those lines, by the time of Malachi, it has come down to one man, one woman, and he kind of reiterates that at that point. Other thoughts you have? Okay, where were we going from here? Yes, sir.
I don't know if you're going to go there because later on in the lesson, it's clear that God is using physical things to teach us spiritual lessons. And to the degree that culture throughout time and our culture abuses these terms and changes the meanings of things, those parallels no longer have the meaning in some people's minds that they would. For instance, all throughout the Bible, God refers to himself as a father. Well, that has a meaning. He's the perfect father. Human fathers are never perfect, but we're supposed to be able to learn from what it is that God intended for physical fathers to be, how God really cares about his children and looks out for them and looks out for their best interests, the same as what Paul was talking about. Yeah, he's talking about marriage, but really he's talking about the church. And when people don't have the proper understanding of the role of husband and wife, you know, where now it's being pushed, you know, well, you're backwards if you think women, you know, have to be subject to their husbands. You know, women can do whatever they want to. Well, if you have that mindset, then it just destroys that whole imagery there that God's trying to teach you.
You've missed the whole point.
Yes, you don't see that. And to the extent that people are raised in all kinds of broken homes and bad families and stuff, those very people are going to have difficulty in understanding what a real father is like. But God gives us evidence in his word that, hey, you may have had a bad father, you may not even know who your father is, but I'm looking out for you, and I've got your best interest at heart, and this is what a true father is supposed to do.
That's exactly right. And to Rocky's point, you know, in the Old Testament, remember, we're talking about the patriarchs. And the patriarchs, even in the time of Moses, the patriarch was responsible for the family. As a father, you know, or as the firstborn son, as I rose to become the patriarch, I was now responsible not just for my immediate family, but the broader family in general. And so I had a responsibility to my brothers and sisters. I had a responsibility to their families. I had a responsibility to a much broader family than my immediate family. And I think we have lost sight of that significantly because of our culture, and and quite frankly, we now are spread out all over the country as opposed to being in a central place. But that was what was intended for the patriarchs. I need to move on because we're not gonna get there real quick. Somebody get with. I'm going to hit Ephesians 6:1-3 regarding children. Children, obey your parent. Excuse me, my voice is changing. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. So it lays out the responsibility of children to their parents. And in the very next verse it says, and you fathers do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. Responsibility of fathers to the children. Bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. So we now have outlined the responsibility of the parents, the husband to the wife, the husband to the children, the wife to the husband, and the children to the father. And yes, to Rocky's point, there's a correlation here with God the Father. Should our responsibility be any different to God the Father? No. No. I was going to do this, but I don't think I'm going to have time, so in fact, I've got 3 minutes. I was actually going to talk about my dad, my family. Like I say, over the last 3 months, as I've been going through things, there was a family history, which I was not aware of a lot of it. My mother had interviewed her mother and some of the things and challenges they grew up with. My father had interviewed his mother and some of the challenges that they grew up with. They were growing up in the early 20s. Social Security, by the way, didn't come in until 1935. My grandmother on my father's side made the statement, we were poor, but we didn't know we were poor. And so I wonder how much that impact had on my dad's upbringing and how by default it had impact on my upbringing. My grandfather on my father's side was not a member of the church until probably within a year or so of his death, when he died of cancer. I was 10 years old at the time. Yet my father, again, my dad would talk about the fact that Grandpa would drive my grandmother and their children to church and sit out in the parking lot and smoke while church was going on, and then he'd drive them home. And yet, my father was a minister of the gospel from a very young age, which I think speaks volumes to my grandmother. So, not an ideal circumstance by any stretch of the imagination, but it was overcome. My mother, a godly mother, I never knew my maternal grandfather. He took his own life when he was 38 years old. My mother was 10. She raised her 2 siblings while my grandmother worked. I don't know what kind of impact that has on a family. I don't know what kind of impact that had on her, because she had to become essentially a mother at 10 years old. She literally raised her younger sister and younger brother. Those are circumstances I cannot imagine. But it was done. It was covered. My mother died a faithful Christian, as did my grandmother. And I can't even imagine the hardship they had to endure during that time. And then they had of course, 3 wonderful children. Families are unique. We're going to cover this really quick, I promise. You guys have already pointed out a number of the things that are unique about family. In some of the cases we'll deal with, Adam and Eve. Did you ever think about this? Where did you learn your parenting skills? From your mother and your father, right? Where did Adam and Eve learn their parenting skills? Yet to Rocky's point, they had one son kill another son. We'll deal with that next week. Noah's righteous family in the holy sinful world. We've talked about that already. His family was the righteous family in the entire world. Can you imagine how many times Japheth came home and said, my friends said that their parents let them do this. And Noah said, and if your friend's parents jumped off a bridge, would you let them? Folks, they're all going to deal with peer pressure, and we have to deal with it as best we can. I dealt with peer pressure. I was involved in peer pressure. I created peer pressure sometimes. What unique situations does your family face? And we're going to talk about this as we deal with each of the individual families. Each week we'll do a lesson for each individual family and talk about the challenges they faced. And then finally, families are messy. Role failure. Eve brought sin into the world. Role failure. Eli's sons. Do you ever wonder? You have Eli, the priest. This is one of the adopted scenarios, by the way. Eli, the priest, has 2 sons. They were extremely evil in the sight of the Lord. Yet Samuel, the adopted son, raised by Eli, grows up to be a prophet. Go figure. Relationship dynamics, impact of the unique situation, and then application, if any. There's your homework. Take a picture, write it down. Please read up on Adam and Eve and their family for next week, and we will discuss. And we'll discuss this in this very same format: structure, unique challenges, unique situations. Thank you all very much.